So as Will said, our theme for this semester is morality. We're talking about right and wrong, we're talking about good and bad, and later in the semester we're going to start talking about specific moral issues like abortion, maybe the death penalty, stuff like that. But before we jump into those topics, we wanted to spend a few weeks talking about metaethics. Now, I know metaethics is kind of a new topic for a lot of folks, but what metaethics is just more foundational than regular ethics. So in ethics, we're talking about maybe which things are right, which things are wrong, whereas in metaethics, we're talking more about what makes something right in the first place, or what makes something wrong in the first place. So last week we talked about a very popular new atheistic theory of morality. We looked at Eric Wielenberg's theory for several reasons. One of the reasons is that he's coming to UNL in a few weeks, but also because his theory and theories like his are really gaining a lot of popularity at the academic level. There's even some folks that are saying that it's the majority position among academic atheist philosophers. And while we might not have seen that theory trickle down to the masses or trickle down to lay folks like us yet, definitely at the academic level it's becoming more and more popular. So we wanted to spend a good solid week, last week, looking at Eric Wielenberg's atheistic Platonism, sometimes it's called. He calls it godless normative realism. So we try to use their terms to be fair to them, so we don't assign our own labels, use their own terms from their own mouth. Thankfully, as I mentioned when we first started this study, there's also been a surge in theistic moral theories, or theistic metaethical theories. And we've talked about some of those as well. Tonight, what I thought would be best is if we look at the two most popular, or the two major theistic positions in metaethics. And this often happens in theology or these sort of circles, is that two major positions usually arise. Doesn't mean those are the only two positions, but it seems like think about election for a moment. You got Calvinism and Arminianism. There's other positions, of course, but those are the two main positions. And what I thought we'd do tonight is look at the two main theistic theories of metaethics. As I mentioned, most all theists affirm that God is the source and foundation of morality. They just disagree on exactly how God plays that role. So we're going to look at these two major positions. And they are, of course, if you saw the email, natural law theory on the left and divine command theory on the right. Now, both of these theories can be found in a lot of different theistic belief systems. So you can even study within Islam. There are these two major positions as well. A lot of ancient Greek philosophers, as we'll see, kind of duked out similar theories. So a lot of theistic belief systems throughout history have kind of come to these same two different conclusions as well. But of course, Ratio Christi is a Christian group. I'm a Christian. So we're going to be focusing at least on the Christian expression of these two theories, how they've developed within Christian theology. Now, before we dive into, we're going to do natural law theory first. Before we dive into them, it's important to understand that every metaethical theory, whether it's theistic or atheistic, it doesn't matter, every metaethical theory tries to explain two things. This is a really important distinction to keep in mind, and you'll see how it comes into play, especially with these two theories. But these are the two things that every metaethical theory needs to try to explain. The first one is moral value, okay? And that simply is what makes something good or bad. The other thing that needs to be explained is moral obligation. This is more of the oughtness of morality, or the shouldness of morality. Sometimes people call it our moral duties. And this is a little bit different than moral value. So within moral obligation, we're asking the question, what makes something right or wrong? Now you might think for just a moment, what's the difference? And as lay people, we often just use these terms interchangeably. But let me illustrate that there is a difference here, and it's an important difference. So think about something that would be good to do, right, morally good, but wouldn't necessarily be obligatory, okay? So for example, let's say we all as a group decided to build an orphanage. I think most everybody would agree that that's a good thing to do, right, morally good, but I don't think anybody would say that we are obligated to do that. Maybe in a certain situation we would be obligated, but just generally, none of us are obligated to do that. However, if we did it, most people would say that was a good thing to do. So you want to have a theory that is able to explain both moral value and moral obligation. Okay? So with that in mind, let's jump into natural law. Now, a lot of people use the term natural law just to mean objective morality. So whenever you're having a conversation with somebody and they use the term natural law, it's important to ask, what do you mean by that? Because if you reject natural law, right, let's say after tonight we've evaluated natural law and you say, no, I don't think that is true, and you're having a conversation with somebody who just uses the term natural law to mean objective morality, and you say you reject natural law, what they're hearing is that you reject objective morality, and you don't want that miscommunication going on. So sometimes natural law is just used, especially in Christian circles, just to mean objective morality. But it's actually a very sophisticated and involved metaethical theory. And that's how we're going to be evaluating it tonight, as this metaethical theory called natural law. So according to natural law, let's start with moral value. So for natural law theorists, what do they say makes something good or bad? Well, according to natural law theorists, they say it's based on human flourishing. In particular, the flourishing of human nature. So if something leads to the flourishing of human nature, that's what makes it good. If something doesn't lead to the flourishing of human nature, then that makes it a bad thing to do. Okay? Now, you may be asking, what is human nature? That's a term that we throw around a lot just in our normal everyday conversations, but in this context, human nature is a very specific concept. And nature, whether we're talking about human nature or God's nature, is the idea that every being has certain properties or attributes that make it that thing. Does that make sense? So let's just talk about human nature, for example. If you have a human nature, then you have all the properties or attributes necessary for being a human. Even if we don't know exactly what those attributes are. I mean, some things we just know aren't necessary. For example, just a silly example, right? Is it necessary to have 10 fingers in order to be human? Well, no, because I could lose some fingers, right, and I would still be human, right? But you can imagine if there's some things that I lost that would make me not a human being anymore. And then this, of course, is debated. What is necessary to be human? Conscious, rationality, relationality. There's all sorts of different things that could make up human nature, and that's even argued about what fills in those list of properties. But regardless of it, it's those things you need to be human. Maybe some Christians would say in the image of God. So human nature, if an action doing something causes your human nature to flourish, then that is considered morally good, according to natural law theory. So I'll give you some quotes. This is from Evans, And he's not a natural law theorist, okay? He would lean more towards divine command theory, but I think he gives a good summary. He says, natural law theorists offer an Aristotelian-inspired account of the good for humans in terms of what completes or perfects human nature, or that enables human flourishing. The vast majority of natural law theorists have explained the good, remember, good, bad, right, wrong, differences, have explained the good for humans in terms of human nature. And I will take this as a defining characteristic of natural law theory. So he's not putting words into their mouth. This is what natural law theorists believe. Now, an important part of natural law theory is that we as humans can know these moral truths through our reason, using our brains, our minds. So evaluating things, evaluating life, evaluating society, and we can see what causes humans to flourish and what doesn't. And it's through that reasoning capacity that allows us to know this natural law, if you will. Give you an example. This is from Craig Boyd, who is a natural law theorist. And I think he has taught or does teach at Biola. Do you recognize him? Is he a Biola guy? I think he is, but I could be wrong. But I know he is a natural law theorist. But he said any properly functioning person will know in his heart and can determine by reason that such actions, in this context he's talking about adultery and murder, do not contribute to true happiness and that therefore they are immoral. So you can imagine a society that was murdering and committing adultery, and you can see how that would cause that society not to flourish. And it's through that process of seeing that and reasoning through that that we can determine or discover good and bad, what causes something to flourish. Now let's talk about one more quote. Oh yeah, I don't want to miss this about natural law theorists. So a lot of natural law theorists claim that the ultimate human flourishing is communion with God. So this term, in this context, the term happiness is thrown around a lot. But don't get thrown off by that. We're not talking about cookies make me happy, stuff like that. Happiness is being used in this context to mean flourishing, human flourishing, okay? So don't, put words into their mouth. They're using it to mean human flourishing. And according to a lot of them, not all of them, but according to a lot of natural law theorists, the ultimate happiness or the ultimate human flourishing is communion with God. So, again, from Boyd, he's talking about Aquinas' view, who was kind of known as one of the biggest natural law theorists in history. But Boyd, describing Aquinas' view, says, our telos, as human beings, our purpose is happiness. That's the goal to which we, by nature, strive. But the only sort of happiness or flourishing that's truly satisfying for human beings is found in communion with God. So that's ultimate flourishing. So in other words, you could define what's morally good by what helps us accomplish a greater communion with God. All right, now let's move on to moral obligation. So within natural law theory, moral value is determined by human nature, whether something causes human nature to flourish or not. And interestingly enough, according to natural law theorists, it's the exact same thing that makes something right or wrong. So natural law theory is one of those unique theories that have the same answer to both of these questions, okay? What generates our obligations? Well, it's facts about human nature and what causes humans to flourish or not. So bottom line is, human nature is the way it is, and certain things cause it to flourish and other things don't. And that's what generates our moral obligations. This is the biggest difference between natural law theory and divine command theory, okay, right here at this point. So I'm going to bring Boyd back up, and he'll explain as a natural law theorist how his view, his theory, differs from divine command theory. So take a look at this. This is what Boyd says. Boyd says that natural law theories ground morality in the human nature that God has created. And again, he is a natural law theorist, so we should know what he's talking about. He says, those of us who subscribe to natural law morality hold that God commands actions because they are right. They claim further that the rightness of actions is determined by various features of human nature rather than by God's commands. You can see the divide here, I trust, between natural law theory and divine command theory. If you can't, then I think this last quote will drive it home. Here is the important point. What makes an act right or wrong is whether it does or does not contribute to human flourishing. That's what causes something to be right or wrong. Not divine commands, human flourishing. God knows what causes human flourishing or not. God knows these things. He knows what's right or wrong. And then he commands and forbids accordingly. So do you see what's driving right and wrong here? What's driving right and wrong are not God's commands, but whether something causes human nature to flourish or not. That's the driver. That's the theory. And God's commands are just telling us what causes humans to flourish and what doesn't. So that's the big difference between natural law theory and divine command theory. So I'm going to take a break and let you guys discuss for a while, and you could jump over here. There's plenty of room right here in front of the couch. And you guys maybe can split up into two groups back there, move the chairs if you need to. Or some of you might want to jump up to our video guys over here. But have some good conversation about natural law theory. Have you heard of it before? Have you understood it like this? Do you think it's true? Why or why not? And then start thinking through maybe some red flags that came up for you, or what objections would you have to this theory. All right, go ahead. I'll give you a few minutes. All right, let's look at some historic objections to natural law theory. And I'm going to try to hold my cards pretty close to the chest. Some of you have read my dissertation, so you know exactly what I believe, but I'm trying to be fair, and even if I do disagree with the position, I always try my best to be fair with it. So I'm going to try my best to keep my cards close to my chest, but you'll probably notice as I deal with these objections, whether I say that they're good or bad objections, that you'll figure out kind of where I fall on this continuum. But these three objections that I want to present to you about or against natural law theory aren't unique to me. They go back hundreds, if not thousands of years. So these have I'm giving you the three major objections that people have raised against natural law theory for you to start chewing on this. And maybe you'll think some of these objections are good, strong, and maybe you think they're not. But that will be for you to think through as I present them to you. So the first objection that a lot of people have to natural law theory is that it's possible, not necessary, but possible within natural law theory to leave God completely out of the picture. So a lot of people are concerned by natural law theory. Hare is one of them. Hare is a divine command theorist. And he says the danger of some kinds of natural law theory is that God disappears into creation, in the sense that we think we can get morality from just our own human nature. And he's not too far off the mark, because there are some atheistic natural law theories, if you can believe that. So again, an atheist could affirm natural law theory and just say, look, what's good is what causes humans to flourish, and what's obligatory is what causes humans to flourish, human nature, humans, and they never have to bring a God into the picture. So there are, I say legitimate, there are actual atheists, atheistic natural law positions. Let me say it that way. So another concern, Mark Murphy, who actually is sympathetic to natural law theory, but he chides them. He says a truly theistic explanation of morality should include God as the immediate ground of morality. Basing what is morally good on human nature is on its face unacceptable as a theistic explanation of moral law, because in natural law theory, you explain moral law in an entirely godless way, if you explain it as the natural law theorist explains it. So even someone who leans towards natural law has this concern. Now, this is a historic concern that a lot of divine command theorists have thrown on natural law theorists, but I think natural law theorists have a good pushback to this objection, okay? So a lot of natural law theorists will push back against this and say, no, God doesn't disappear in our theory. And this would be the theistic natural law people, of course. They would say, no, God plays a very important role in our theory, because it is He, God, who created human nature to be the way it is. So as the creator, God ultimately is the foundation of morality, because He's the one who made human nature to be the way it is, which fixes moral truth. The human nature is what fixes it, but God created and chose human nature to be a certain way. So that's how God plays an important role. Give you an example. So this is Hugo Grotius, I believe it's pronounced. He is the father of modern natural law theory. And he wrote that even that natural law of which we have spoken about, although it does proceed from the internal principles of man, may yet be rightly ascribed to God, because it was by His will that such principles came to exist in us. He's the one who created human nature the way it is. So God is the ultimate foundation of morality, not human nature. Now, this doesn't satisfy the divine command theorists, right, who are pressing this objection. So Evans, a divine command theorist, he agrees with Murphy that to give a satisfying account of morality as a whole, we need God to play a more central role than simply as the creator of natural kinds that determine the good. So the natural law theorist wants to say, God is the creator of human nature, plays a central role. And the divine command theorist says, no, that's not a very central role. So then it comes, how do you define central role? But that's where the conversation goes. Let's move on to the second objection. This one's a little bit interesting. A lot of natural law theorists kind of scratch their head when they first hear this. But I think it's at least a worthwhile objection to consider. But here's how it goes. Some people object to natural law theory because they try to show that ultimately it results in relative morality. Now, for a natural law theorist, that just blows their mind, because one of the reasons most people who are natural law theorists love natural law theory is because it affirms an objective morality. And so if you say it actually results in relative morality, that is the opposite of what they're trying to do. But here's how it might play out. Take a look at this. So somebody objecting to natural law theory might say, look, for morality to be objective and absolute, it has to have a foundation that is not contingent or relative in any way. It's got to be a stable, necessary foundation to have absolute objective morality. And human nature isn't that stable, isn't that necessary, if you will. Human nature is more contingent. And what I mean by that is that human nature could have been different if God would have made us differently, right? I think that's easy to conceptualize. So, according to natural law theory, morality is in fact relative to human nature. So that if human nature was different, then morality would be different. And we want to say, Christians, divine command theorists, we want to say that there's something more rigid or objective or absolute or permanent about morality than merely human nature. Because human nature could have been different. So I'll just give you some silly examples. These are just like thought experiments. The first one's not very silly. Just consider angels. So we would say that angels have a nature too, not human nature, but an angelic nature, all the properties that are necessary to be an angel, right? A horse would have a horse nature. So there's all sorts of different natures out there. But what if, let's say, God would have created us more like angels, non-sexual beings? So if God would have created humans more like that, then the sexual or morality, moral truths about sex would be a lot different, because there wouldn't really be sex among humans if we were asexual like angels. So more of a silly example, let's say God would have created our natures to be such that when we died, it felt really good, and then we came back to life 10 seconds later. And I know that's a silly thought experiment, but God could have created us like that. And if He would have created us that way, then the commands about killing and murder, or the moral truth about murder and killing, would be a lot different, right? So do you see how changing human nature would then change moral truth? It'd be relative in the sense it's relative, according to natural law theory, it's relative to how human nature is. And most times we want to, especially as Christians, we want to say that morality is not relative in any sense. So, going back to Evans, who's a divine command theorist, he says with natural law theory, moral good is determined by our nature such that, as I've been saying, if human nature were fundamentally different, what would be good for humans would be fundamentally different as well. So this is why some people conclude that natural law theory or human nature is just insufficient as the absolute core foundation of morality. To be objective and absolute instead of relative, morality has to be grounded in something necessary and absolute, something more stable, if you will, than human nature, which God could have made differently. Okay, we're going to talk about one more objection to natural law theory, and then I want to give you guys some time to discuss these objections. Some people reject natural law theory because it leads, according to them, to the absurd conclusion that God is not a moral being. And whereas maybe this objection number 2, is divine command theorists claiming something about natural law theory, that it leads to a nefarious conclusion that's not good, this conclusion is actually affirmed by a lot of natural law theorists. And I'm going to show you that a lot of natural law theorists affirm that God is not a moral being. And a lot of Christians would just say that's an absurd conclusion, so something has gone wrong in your reasoning. So let me give you some examples of natural law theorists who affirm this. All right? You need me to pause for a little bit, Wesley? So the first natural law theorist, this is Richard Howe. He was one of my professors at Southern Evangelical Seminary. But he's a natural law theorist, and he admits, yes, according to natural law theory, it follows that God is not a moral being. Now, let him explain what he means by that, because at first it sounds shocking, okay? So I said, this is the case because God does not choose a course of action to perfect himself. God can't be perfected because he already is perfect. He already is infinitely perfect. Another big name in natural law theory is Davies. I don't have a quote from him, but Davies argued that it's inappropriate to call God a moral being. It's inappropriate to call God morally good, and it's inappropriate to call God a moral agent. So if you haven't picked up on the reasoning yet, let me lay it out here in a simple argument, okay? So according to natural law theory, moral good is that which leads a being to flourish, okay? So let's say for an angel, what is morally good for an angel is what leads to the flourishing of angelic nature. And we're talking about human nature for the most part tonight. But when it comes to God's nature, he can't really flourish because he's already perfect. And that makes sense, right? There's nothing he can do to flourish more. So morality doesn't really apply to God. In other words, he's not a moral being. And this isn't an argument like the previous objection that is laid on top of natural law theory. This is an argument that natural law theorists themselves make, okay? And some people would just say that's absurd. You're admitting that your theory results in this crazy, absurd conclusion. You might be thinking, you know, what about all the Bible verses that say that God is morally good or that describe God in moral ways? Well, these natural law theorists will explain those verses away as mere anthropomorphisms. So here's an example of that. This is another one of the professors that I had at Southern Evangelical Seminary. So Brian Huffling, I won't read the whole quote, but he talks about how the Bible often describes God, for example, in physical terms. You know, God has a strong arm, those sort of things. And we know those are anthropomorphisms, right? We know those shouldn't be taken literally because there's other verses in the Bible that say that God is not physical, that he's a spiritual being. And so we know, just from the Bible itself, that those verses which describe God in physical terms should be taken as anthropomorphisms, just ways of speaking, metaphors, if you will, that help us to understand, but shouldn't be taken literally. Okay? Now, I affirm that the Bible uses anthropomorphisms. I don't believe that God has a strong arm, literally. But the reason that I know that that's an anthropomorphism is because other places in the Bible say that God is spiritual. The problem, I think, with using this to defend natural law theory is that nowhere in the Bible does it say that God isn't a moral being. In other words, if there was a verse in the Bible that, you know, explained this and said God really isn't a moral being, moral concepts don't really apply to God, then I would know for sure that all those verses that describe him in moral ways are anthropomorphisms. But nowhere does the Bible say that God is not a moral being. They've arrived at that conclusion that God is not a moral being through their philosophical reasoning. I'm not against philosophical reasoning. However, when philosophical reasoning takes you to an absurd conclusion, you might want to rethink your philosophical reasoning. Does that make sense? I'm not saying you should never do philosophical reasoning. I mean, I just finished a PhD in philosophy. I think that's very useful, and we can learn and discover a lot of truth through philosophical reasoning. But when your philosophical reasoning takes you to an absurd conclusion, you might want to rethink your reasoning. So, I'll use that example here. If you define moral good this way, in premise 1, if you define moral good as that which leads to a being to flourish, then I think the conclusion follows. I think Howe is exactly right. So the logic here is good, right? The logic here I would affirm. Of course, if that's how you define moral good, then sure, God's not a moral being. But the key question is premise 1 correct? Is that the right way to define moral good? And again, if your conclusion results in an absurdity, as I see it, and it results in you having to try to explain away hundreds and hundreds of Bible verses, boy, I would think that would cause you to go back and rethink your first premise and rethink if that's really the best way to define moral good. So I'll let David Baggett wrap up this objection. He's concerned about this aspect of natural law theory as well. So David Baggett, he says, this further denial of God's goodness is exactly where Davies is most vulnerable to criticism. Davies here would be the biggest name in natural law theory making this claim that God's not a moral being. The way he defines his terms, like I just said, the way that Davies and these folks define their terms, he's not wrong, but the sober fact is that his definition of moral goodness is overly narrow. So again, the logic might be good, but the first premise is what's off, the definition of moral goodness. So Davies ends up denying rational ascriptions of moral goodness to God in a way that just invites unnecessary misunderstanding and leaves the door open to things that should never be admitted. Now I think the Baggett is being very nice here. I'm much more comfortable saying this is just an absurd conclusion that natural law theory results in. Okay, so those are the 3 main objections to natural law theory, and I'll let you chew on them for a bit and discuss them. Which one do you think is the strongest? Which one do you think is the weakest? Are you still a natural law theorist? Have you moved? Would you still defend it? What do you think and why? So go ahead and discuss for a few minutes. We're going to shift gears now to the other major theory. Again, these aren't the only 2. But what I wanted to give you guys is at least the 2 major Christian theories of metaethics. So we're going to move now from natural law theory over to divine command theory. So as natural law theory, as we've learned, natural law theorists say that obligations are generated by facts about human nature, what causes us to flourish or not flourish. But the divine command theorist is going to look at that and say, does it really make sense that we're obligated by natures or properties or facts about humans? Is that what makes us obligated? Are we obligated to those sort of things? A divine command theorist is going to say, it seems like obligations come more from our relationships. In other words, it seems like obligation is more about having duties to someone, or we're obligated to somebody else. We're obligated to persons, not facts or natures or even principles, really. We're obligated to other persons. So a divine command theorist like John Hare says, moral obligation requires not just a presumption against doing something, but an obligator. And that deducibility from human nature and non-divine facts alone, therefore, has to be denied. So he would affirm divine command theory instead of natural law theory, because it just seems like our obligations have to come from someone, not just facts. So if you take a look at divine command theory, that's the major position of this theory, that obligations are generated by God's commands. Ultimately, we're obligated to God, and we know about those obligations when He gives us commands to follow. Now, divine command theorists will affirm that obligations arise from other things, of course. So like I have obligations to my children, I have obligations to my wife. I have obligations to society. So it's not merely my obligations to God, but God is the ultimate source of obligations, that He is the first link in the chain, so to speak. So, for example, God gives us very general commands like love your neighbor as yourself. And then the various relationships I have with different people generate different obligations. So let's say maybe I'm more obligated to my family than I am my neighbor. And I'm more obligated to my neighbor across the street than I am maybe somebody on the other side of America. Right? So the different relationships generate different obligations, but God is the ultimate head or the ultimate link in the chain, such that if there was no God or there weren't any general divine commands, we wouldn't have any obligations, according to divine command theory. Now, what a lot of people forget or don't understand is that divine command theory is only a theory of moral obligation. Okay? So divine command theory doesn't have really anything to say about moral value. Divine command theory only proposes an explanation of moral obligation, what makes something right or wrong. So, it's been pointed out that you can combine other theories of moral value with a moral obligation theory of divine commands. Does that make sense? So you could bring in other theories, you have to bring in some other theory to explain moral value, because divine command theory is only trying to explain moral obligation. So, for example, Evans, we've seen it several times tonight, Evans points out that you can actually combine the two theories. You can have a natural law theory of moral value, what's good or bad is depending upon human flourishing, but then a divine command theory of moral obligation, what makes something right or wrong. And there are those who hold this. Now, most of the time, if you find somebody who's affirming natural law theory with moral value, they're going to also affirm that for moral obligation too, but this is a possibility. I was going to have you discuss divine command theory, but I think for the sake of time, let's just go through the 3 objections that I brought, and then you guys can discuss it all together. So here's the first objection that a lot of people raise, and this would be an objection not only from atheists like Eric Wielenberg, but also an objection from natural law theorists. Okay, so it's a very common objection to divine command theory. They would say, look, people that don't know about God's commands or don't even believe that there is a God would then not have any moral obligations. And that would be a big problem with your moral theory. If your moral theory results in, again, this would be like resulting in an absurd conclusion, right? An absurdity, that there's whole swaths of people that have no moral obligations, you don't want that a part of your theory, right? So, like Wielenberg points out, divine command theory seems to imply that reasonable non-believers would have no moral obligations at all, since they don't recognize any commands having been issued by a God. Now, I think the divine command theorist can respond to this fairly well, because the term command causes a lot of confusion, and it's just unfortunate. We've talked about this before, how different names and different labels get generated and they just stick whether you like them or not. But divine command theory probably isn't the best name for the theory, because it just generates so much confusion. Because, I mean, just use yourself as an example. What do you think of when you think of divine commands? Well, the 10 Commandments, right? God commands not to murder, not to commit adultery, not to steal, and so we just think of commands as not only the Ten Commandments, but that's the classic type of command, thou shalt not XYZ. But in this context, and this is what's hard, you just have to learn the jargon, in this context, when we talk about divine command theory, we're not using the term command in that narrow of a sense, okay? In this context, when a divine command theorist uses the term command, they're actually using it to include all of the ways that God makes us aware of moral truth, not just direct verbal instructions like the Ten Commandments. It includes that, of course, but for most divine command theorists, it would also include our moral intuition, our conscience, even our reason, philosophical reasoning. So, for example, divine command theorist like Stephen Evans explains, when I talk about divine commands, I'm using the term command in a very extended, a broad sense to refer to what God wills humans to do insofar as His will has been communicated to humans. And as most Christians, I think, would affirm, God communicates these moral truths in many ways. Yes, directly through the Ten Commandments and other direct verbal instructions, but He also communicates truth in many other ways as well. So, classic example from Romans 2. In Romans, Paul is explaining that no one is going to be able to avoid God's judgment by using the excuse they were unaware of right and wrong. So Paul explains in Romans 2, even those who had never had direct verbal commands from God will have no excuse, because those who do not have the law, like Ten Commandments, Old Testament law, do instinctively the things of the law. These, not having the law, are a law to themselves in that they show the work of the law written on their hearts, their conscience bearing witness, and their thoughts alternately accusing or else defending them. So even the Bible says that people can know right from wrong because God has revealed it to them through their conscience, moral intuition, whatever you want to call it. It's not merely direct verbal instructions that we're talking about here. So, just replying to this objection, divine command theorists can say, look, people have obligations, even unbelievers, even those who don't believe that there is a God, they have obligations, even though they don't actually understand that those obligations come from God. So a sophisticated divine command theorist is going to say, look, for a person to have obligations, moral obligations, God only has to make them aware of what's right and wrong, and that they should do the right thing. They don't need to know the details of how obligations are generated, and they don't need to know that these things being His commands is what makes them obligatory. All that God needs to make them aware of, according to Romans 2, is what's right and wrong, and that they should do the right. And that's enough to generate moral obligations for them. So I think divine command theorists have a satisfactory answer to that objection. All right, number 2. This comes from people who would consider themselves divine will theorists. Okay, as I said before, there's more than just natural law theory and divine command theory. There's another position out there called divine will theory. Okay? And a divine will theorist is going to say, look, it's not God's commands that generate obligations, it's His will or His intentions. There's a lot of different words to describe it, but it boils down to God's will. God's will is what generates obligations, not His commands. This might be one of those times where it's hard to see a difference between the two, but man, I think, explains where the difference comes. So just think about this for a second. The difference between divine command theory and divine will theory, those differences emerge when we do a thought experiment to consider cases in which the two theories might part ways. So might there be cases in which God commands something that He does not will? Conversely, might there be cases in which God wills something that he does not command? In either case, what generates the obligation, the command or the will? This might be splitting hairs, but it's important to think through. Now, a divine command theorist is going to push back on a divine will theorist and say, look, we simply could not have obligations if we were unaware of them. And this is even implied in Romans 2, right? I mean, Romans 2 implies that if somebody were hypothetically unaware of right and wrong, then they wouldn't be fairly judged by God. So even Romans 2 implies that somebody has to know about right and wrong in order to have obligations. And that's why Paul says nobody can use that excuse, because everybody knows right from wrong. Therefore, they are obligated. So I think Evans fleshes this out well. Again, he's a divine command theorist. So he wrote, suppose one says the moral obligations are established by God's will alone rather than God's command. That's what the divine will theorist says. The difficulty with such a view is that it seems to make morality impossible unless God's will is somehow expressed in such a way that can be known. Divine commands, moral intuition, conscience. If God's will constitutes our moral obligations and God's will is a closely guarded secret, then the best humans could do would be to guess about their moral obligations. I think Adams even makes a better point. This is Robert Adams here, probably one of the most famous divine command theorists alive today. Adams wrote, the idea that God's will alone could impose obligations without being revealed to us yields a very unattractive picture of divine human relations, one in which the wish of God's heart imposes binding obligations without even being communicated to us. But look, games in which one party incurs guilt for failing to guess the unexpressed wishes of the other party are just not very nice games. So I think this is a good and strong reply to this objection. Let me wrap it up this way, the second objection. I think the divine will theorists are making a good point, okay? I think they're affirming something right on. I think they're drawing attention to an important truth, and this is the way that I think it's best phrased. And it's that our obligations, though they originate in God's will, they're only generated when God makes us aware of them somehow. And again, it doesn't have to be direct verbal instructions like the Ten Commandments. It can be through moral intuition, conscience, even moral reasoning. So we can say that God's will is the foundation of our obligations, but it's God making us aware of these things is what actually generates the obligation. Okay, last one and we'll be done. The third objection to divine command theory is that some people argue it makes morality arbitrary. Think about it for a moment. If morality is just based on God's will, what God wills to command, then morality is arbitrary because God could have chosen to command anything. And most people don't want to conclude in their theory that morality is arbitrary. Kind of like before when we said about the natural law theorists, they don't like the idea that morality is relative. They want it to be absolute, firm, universal, absolute. So if morality was arbitrary, that would be a bad thing in your theory. However, that's what people claim about divine command theory, that it makes morality arbitrary. This is actually the first horn of the Euthyphro Dilemma, if you're familiar with that, and we'll talk more about that in a minute. But take a look at Boyd. Boyd is a natural law theorist, and so he's pressing this objection against divine command theorists. He says divine command theory holds that the rightness of actions is determined solely by the commands of God. And of course, God isn't subject to some independent standard of morality. So he's free to command whatever he wills. And this would make morality arbitrary, because then, God could just will anything. He could will or command that rape is good. And if he commanded that rape was okay, then that would make it okay. And that seems to be completely arbitrary, and most people wouldn't want that conclusion. So as Mann points out, this conjures up images of a God who might have approved of just anything, murder, rape, and might have disapproved of anything, including, love. Now, to be fair, the people pressing this objection are making a good point about some divine command theories, okay? There are some divine command theories that base morality only on God's sovereign will, okay? Most famously, William of Ockham, but there's others. I believe Descartes was this way as well. But these type of divine command theories are sometimes called strong divine command theories. So this is Linda Zagzebski. She's a Christian philosophy professor at the University of Oklahoma. We've talked about her before. But she explains that these particular divine command theories, these strong ones, are strong because they say that God's will is logically or metaphysically prior to both good, bad, and right and wrong. So these strong divine command theories maintain that God created morality by a sheer act of his free will and then imposed it on us. So let me give you some historical background here as to maybe where these strong divine command theories came from, okay? And I think this will be really useful just so you can understand the background here and where this conversation has come from. So part of the historic move from the pre-modern era to the modern era was a rejection of natures. We've talked about natures a lot tonight. Human nature, God having a nature. And in the modern era, people started rejecting the idea that there even are natures. Human nature, God having a nature. And so, whereas pre-modern theologians would emphasize God's nature, in the modern era, when natures were kind of pushed away, modern theologians started emphasizing God's sovereign will. So you see the difference in the emphasis? Pre-modern theologians emphasizing God's nature, modern theologians emphasizing God's sovereign will. And for these modern theologians, I'm talking, 1500s, 1600s, modern era, beginning of the modern era, to protect God's sovereignty, they argued that God is free to choose anything he wants. Nothing can constrain God's will, because they were protecting this sovereign will as they saw it. The emphasis was on God's will instead of his nature. As a side note, most all the Protestant reformers inherited this mistake of the modern era, and it led to all sorts of, as I see it, theological problems. But in the context here of this meta-ethical conversation, when natures were rejected, God having a nature, humans having a nature, when natures, the idea of natures were pushed aside, of course natural law theory fell away too, and nothing was left to base morality on but God's sovereign will. And if that's how you view it, you're going to have a very strong divine command theory that says, yes, God is sovereign and he can declare that anything is morally right or wrong, because they wanted to protect that will. Just some historical background here. The point I'm trying to make is that just because some people adopted divine command theory because they rejected natures doesn't mean everybody who affirms divine command theory rejects natures. So I'll lay my cards out on the table. I am one of those people. I affirm divine command theory, Not because I deny natures. I fully believe in human nature. I believe that God has a nature. So you can affirm natures and divine command theory. But the history is that these strong divine command theories did arise in the context of rejecting the idea of natures. Okay, the last thing I want to point out is this Euthyphro dilemma. And a lot of people, and I have lots of conversations, even at the university, about this Euthyphro dilemma. Because a lot of people have concluded, even philosophy professors, that the Euthyphro dilemma has pretty much destroyed divine command theory. That divine command theory is just a dead theory because of the Euthyphro dilemma. And I won't give you the whole history of that, but the Euthyphro dilemma goes all the way back, at least to Plato. So it's an old dilemma. And I'm not the only one who says that. I mean, even Eric Wielenberg says the Euthyphro dilemma doesn't work. So I'm going to try to push back against this Euthyphro dilemma here. As I said, this what we're talking about, this objection that it makes morality arbitrary, is the first horn of the Euthyphro dilemma. So here's what the Euthyphro dilemma says in a nutshell. Okay, the Euthyphro dilemma says, divine command theory is stuck having to choose one of these unappealing horns. You got to have one or the other. So the first horn is that, as we've talked about with strong divine command theories, God could choose to make anything morally right, even rape. That's an absurd conclusion, right? You wouldn't like that. We'd try to avoid that because it makes morality arbitrary. Well, the only other option, according to the Euthyphro dilemma, is that there's a moral standard outside of God which constrains him to only command certain things. So there's a moral standard outside of God, and he considers that moral standard when he chooses what to command. But if that's the case, then all of a sudden now you've got this external standard being the foundation of morality, not God. And most theists want to make God the source and foundation of morality. So, as I said, a lot of people think that this is the death nail of divine command theory. But there's a simple reply to this, and oftentimes when people try to stick you with the dilemma, or stick you with the two horns of dilemma, the simple thing to ask is, well, isn't there another option? Why is there only two? It seems like you've created this dilemma for yourself by limiting the options to only two. So the solution to the Euthyphro dilemma, which itself might actually go back to Plato, there's disagreement on that, but most people, most philosophers, especially divine command theorists today, would say this dilemma has been sufficiently answered by bringing in a third option. So yes, it would be bad, it would not be good if there was some external standard of morality that God had to refer to. But what if there is an internal standard of morality? What if there is a standard of morality that's not external to God, but is internal to God? So the third option that's been proposed as a solution to this dilemma is that, look, yes, there is a constraint on God's will. Strong divine command theorists have a conniption fit at this point because they want to protect that sovereign will. There's nothing that constrains God's will. But this third option says, yeah, there actually is something that constrains God's will, and it's his moral nature. Just like God himself says that he is unable to lie. He's not sovereign enough to lie, if you will. Because there's something that constrains him from doing certain things, and that is his own moral nature. So here's an example of divine command theorists affirming natures, human nature, in this case, God's nature. So the solution to the Euthyphro dilemma is that there is a standard of morality that constrains God, but it's inside of God, not external to him. And then that solves the Euthyphro dilemma according to many divine command theorists. So I'll give you just one example. This is Philip Quinn. It's the divine nature itself and not divine commands or his will, intentions, that constrains the intentions God can form in choosing which commands to give. Again, a strong divine command theorist is not going to be okay with this because they want to protect God's sovereign will, but I'm a divine command theorist who definitely affirms this. Okay, so we discussed divine command theory and we looked at 3 objections to it, and I want to give you guys a few minutes to discuss these objections, which ones you think are strong, weak. Right. The last thing I want to do tonight, and this won't take just a couple minutes, but I just want to begin introducing you to probably the most sophisticated divine command theory that's out there right now. Again, divine command theory isn't a new theory. It's been around for hundreds, if not thousands of years. But like everything, there's always more work being done on it. And there's contemporary defenders of it and contemporary people who oppose it. And so the conversation is ongoing, and the one person who's probably done the most work in promoting divine command theory and developing a very robust, sophisticated divine command theory that, by the way, Eric Wielenberg has a lot of respect for, is Robert Adams. We've talked about Robert Adams before. He's been a philosophy professor. Him and his wife are both Christians. But he's been a philosophy professor at many major universities. He spent most of his time at Yale. But his book, Finite and Infinite Goods, has kind of become well known in the conversation as the key divine command theory over the last 50 years. So Robert Adams. And if you remember, divine command theory only tries to explain moral obligation, so it has to be combined with something. And so tonight, all I wanted to do is just tell you, flesh out the rest of Robert Adams' theory. Okay? He affirms divine command theory when it comes to moral obligation, but he has a different theory for moral value. And this is what a lot of people forget and misunderstand, because they just hear, oh, he's a divine command theorist, and they forget the whole first half of his theory has to do with moral value. So, what does Robert Adams say determines moral value? According to him, something is good if it resembles God's moral nature. And something is bad, of course, if it doesn't resemble or image or reflect, however you want to say it, God's moral nature. In a morally pertinent way, obviously. And next week we'll talk about exactly more what this means. But I just wanted to introduce you to his theory, because next week, what I did in my dissertation is I tried to build on this theory. So I tried to take it one step further and say, specifically in God's moral nature, what determines what something is good or bad is God's Trinitarian nature, the loving relationships between the members of the Trinity. So if something resembles the loving relationships between the members of the Trinity, then it's morally good. And if it doesn't reflect, doesn't image, doesn't resemble the loving relationships between the Trinity, then it's morally bad. So next week I want to spend the majority of our time first understanding Robert Adams' theory, and then how I built mine really on his foundation. I just, as I see it, took it one step further and pinpointed within God what is the foundation of morality. In my case is that it's the loving relationships between the members of the Trinity. So we'll close with this. Just one quote from Robert Adams where he's explaining this first part of his theory, moral value. He says, the part played by God in my account of the good, moral good and bad, is similar to that of the form of the beautiful or the good in Plato's thinking. God is the supreme good, and the goodness of other things consists in a sort of resemblance to God. Now, this doesn't make his theory Platonic like Wielenberg's theory is Platonic, because Wielenberg affirms Plato's abstract objects, the beautiful, the good. What Adams is saying is no, Adams is proposing that there is a God, a concrete object, a personal being, who plays the role of the good that Plato proposed. So Plato proposed these abstract objects, and Robert Adams says, no, I'm proposing a concrete object, God, as the supreme good. And then when we look at human actions, building an orphanage, being kind to somebody, loving your neighbor, those things are good because they reflect God's moral nature. And we're going to see next week that he's not alone in this. I'm going to make the case for you next week that this is what the Bible teaches, that a lot of the ancient Greek philosophers affirm this, that the major Christian theologians all through church history affirm this, and that a lot of other contemporary Christian theologians and philosophers affirm this. So it's not unique to him, just like divine command theory isn't unique to him, but he is the major advocate of this theory today, if that makes sense. Just like, the ideas of Calvinism had been around long before Calvin, but he just was a very strong proponent of those ideas. And that's why we call it today Calvinism. Okay, let's stop there, but I want to give some time for questions. I know we had a lot to cover tonight, but what questions came up for you guys that maybe I could try to help with tonight? Any clarifying questions or something completely off the wall is fine. What do you guys got? Go ahead, Joel.
So, this is both an ontological and epistemological question concerning natural law, and I thought of it. So, if the natural law theorist grounds both the moral values and moral duties in human flourishing, how does one distinguish between just merely that which is good and that which they are obligated to do, or how is that actually ontologically separated? Like if we gave the building an orphanage example, well, that's good, but we're not required to do it. It would definitely lead to human flourishing, but we wouldn't say that maybe that aspect of human flourishing generates a moral obligation to do that. I didn't know.
Yeah, I'd have to think through exactly how they would say that, and I don't want to put words in their mouth, but my best guess on the spot would be that, yeah, there would be some facts about human nature are strong enough or robust enough that they generate moral value, good or bad, and other facts of human nature would generate moral obligation. So the classic example, if you're walking down the street and you see a child in flames and there's a big bucket of water there, well, it's facts about human nature, maybe that they're made in the image of God, and facts that you have the ability to do something about it, and it's those facts that generate the obligation to douse the flames and rescue the child. So it's facts about the child and you that generate the moral obligation. I think they would say that's also a good thing to do, but there might be other situations, maybe I can't think of one on the top of my head, but there's other situations that would generate moral goodness, but that wouldn't generate obligations for you. So they might just see a difference in what these facts of human nature, different facts of human nature can do and can't do.
Okay.
That'd be my best guess is what they would say,
Yeah.
but I could be wrong. Go ahead.
Back in natural law theory as well, you said that Boyd said that God commands things because they are right. Would that statement and would natural law also fall prey to Euthyphro's dilemma?
Go back to Euthyphro's dilemma. Well, again, for a natural law theorist, what's right is what, causes humans to flourish. So what causes humans to flourish is kind of what determines right and wrong. And then God knows, I'm going to talk about God in a human sense, but God sees what causes humans to flourish, or he just knows already. And then he commands those things which are right, which cause humans to flourish. So the flourishing comes first, and then God's commands come because of the flourishing or the not flourishing. So let me try to put that in the Euthyphro Dilemma.
Is Wesley saying that the human flourishing represents the standard that is external to God that he then is, quote unquote, abiding by? Is that what you're bringing up?
I guess you could say, like the first one, kind of like one of the objections to natural law theory, that God could have created our human nature in any way. It could be like the angels, so we're not sexual, or created us so that if we die, it's a lot of fun and we come back to life again. So it might make morality arbitrary. Unless a natural law theorist would take the same strategy and say, well, God created our human nature to be a certain way because of his own moral nature. And that helped determine why he created human nature the way it is. So that might be a way for a natural law theorist to avoid that objection that we talked about. Does everybody follow me with that? That was a long thought process, but...
What about on the flip side, that the human flourishing constitutes the standard that is itself external to God? In other words, God is... there's a moral standard outside of God that he considers when choosing what to command. Would that be human flourishing itself would be that standard? Is this kind of comparison we're making?
But I think the natural law theorist could still punt or just go to option 3 and say, no, it's not that human nature is constraining God, because God chose to make human nature the way it is. So it's not as though there's something external constraining God. God's the one who chose human nature to be what it is in the first place. I think that's how a natural law theorist could avoid both of those horns. But I'll leave the natural law to do his own work. I'll leave the natural law theorist to do his own work, since I'm not one. But I could try to help him out from time to time. All right, what else? Sam, you had a question?
Your third objection to natural law was that God, that leaves God in a state where like he can't flourish, like what standard is he by? But what's to say there isn't a standard God in nature that he is perfectly fulfilled? He is perfectly flourishing.
Yes, and that's how a natural law theorist would understand it, that he's already perfect, that he's already perfectly flourishing, and therefore there wouldn't really be any concepts that would apply to him that would help him flourish more. At least that's how the natural law theorist sees it. But I understand what you're getting at.
It doesn't seem like an inconsistency. He's just perfectly fulfilling his flourishing, whereas we are not.
Yeah. But again, the way the natural law theorist wants to define morality is that whatever leads to human flourishing or causes human flourishing. So they would say, even before the fall, if I understand them right, that, certain things would be, even though there was no sin before the fall, some things led to human flourishing more than others. And so some things would be more morally good than other things. And that concept, that idea can't even apply to God because there's nothing he could do that would cause him to flourish more. At least that's their own thought process of the natural law theorists.
Does flourishing have to be defined in a human sense, though, of progress?
Not at all.
Okay.
And that's why it's, so what is morally good for an angel would be different.
Right.
Because angels have a different nature than we do.
Right. Because one of the discussions we were having was depending on how you define flourish, it doesn't necessarily have to fall into some of those objections. if you theologically, I guess I was saying, if you theologically believe that a human really flourishing is being in communion with God, then that is not going outside, then obviously God is central to that. But also God himself, in the Trinitarian relationship, is also flourishing within himself, being in relationship with himself. And so, yeah, I don't know. I guess that's kind of where I'm questioning if natural law theory has to mean humans flourishing as in progress or something like that, you know.
Yeah, no, for a natural law theorist, it's whatever is morally good for a particular being is what causes that particular being to flourish. And then, you know, what it means for a particular being to flourish is determined by God. So for a horse, you know, God designed horses in such a way, so we don't have to go into specifics here, but you know what a flourishing horse looks like compared to a horse that's not doing well, right? Or a herd of horses that's not doing well. You can see which, you know, a group that's flourishing, and as people, you know, human beings who have raised horses and bred horses, we understand what makes for a good horse.
Right.
And so horse flourishing is different than human flourishing.
Right.
And angelic flourishing would be different than...
Yeah, because that's the thing too, is that flourishing, yes, God doesn't need us, he doesn't need any of these things, he's perfect, but at the same time, the scriptures do talk about God taking delight in his communion with us, that the Father and Son take delight in each other. And so I think depending on how you define, again, flourishing, I think that doesn't have to be a contradiction with how God's infallibility is described theologically.
Well, one of my concerns, and again, these are some of my professors that I had at seminary that I respectfully disagreed with, but one of the concerns that I would always have through the natural law theory explanation is that not only natural law, but other things that were part of their theology ended up making God so completely different than human beings. And these sort of folks, they want to protect making God too human-like. You know, there's a danger on that side too. So we don't want to make God just like your next door buddy, right? We don't want to make God too human, but we also don't want to get to the point where there is no connection between God and humans whatsoever. And that's kind of what happens in this way of thinking where, you know, God's not a moral being, moral concepts don't apply to God. God is just this holy other that we can't even really understand because he's so different. So there's a danger over here and there's a danger over here. And they're, you know, more closer to this danger because they're so against this danger. Where, you know, in everything, there's probably a middle ground that's the correct position where we're made in the image of God and there are attributes that we can share with God, being a moral being, being conscious, they would even deny that. Communicable attributes, attributes that we can share with God. And then there's incommunicable attributes that we could never have, like omniscient and omnipotent, right? So most theologians have affirmed there are some similarities between us and God because we're made in his image. And then there's things about us and God that are completely different and can never be brought together. So there's two extremes to avoid. And I just find that these natural law theorists, both in this theology and their other Thomistic theology, end up creating such a chasm between God and human that we can't even really know what God is like at all. And I'm stereotyping them and overgeneralizing, but that's the danger of this side. There's also a danger in theology of making God too human-like. We want to avoid that too. But all right, any other thoughts, questions? Go ahead, Joel.
So I've heard some divine command theorists try to make a careful distinction between what they say is moral evil and like natural evil, and so they would say that maybe natural evil is excluded from that theory. Or I know one of them when talking about the child who's on fire and there's a bucket of water nearby, you know, that situation in and of itself is not necessarily morally evil. Now somebody has a moral obligation to relieve suffering if they see that and to end that. And it would be morally evil if somebody set the child on fire, right? But that situation might not itself be morally evil. And so I was wondering then on the flip side, on natural law theory, since human flourishing is suddenly the basis of what constitutes what is good, morally good, does natural law proponents sometimes see kind of a melding between moral and natural evil, or moral and natural good in that way? Because human flourishing is affected or not affected by these natural, a child being on fire or something like that?
Yeah, the first thought that comes to mind, and this might be related, maybe you guys can help me think through this because it's hard to think on the spot, but the first thing that comes to mind is I've been around some natural law theorists, and I've heard some natural law theorists give lectures where they indicate, or they seem to imply, that anything that is finite is somehow evil, or anything that is finite is somehow less than the ultimate good, which is God. So in other words, by definition, unless you're God, you're going to be finite. And inherent in finiteness is a lesser than goodness. So I think if they have that sort of way of thinking, which I reject, but if they have that way of thinking, then maybe they would consider, natural evil to have some moral dimension. Because what I would reject is that finiteness inherently has a moral component, or that necessarily has just because something is finite makes it morally evil. I would say you're mixing categories here.
Yeah.
You need to keep finite and infinite, separate. That's a separate category. What's that called when you mix categories? It's a fallacy. Category error? Yeah, there's a fallacy. I can't remember the name of it. But then the moral category you want to keep separate from that. Just because something is finite doesn't necessarily mean it's morally evil. But if they are saying that, then that might make them more comfortable, though I can't remember them ever saying it that way, but it might make them more comfortable with the idea that natural evil has a moral dimension to it.
If there's a sense in which like an earthquake can really inhibit human flourishing, would that make
Yeah.
the circumstances of the earthquake morally evil, or I don't know.
Yeah, I think in that sense they would, because it's part of the finiteness. It's not omnipotent. There's something about it that's finite, and therefore there is an element of moral evil to it. And I think that's just a mixing up of categories. But I don't want to put words in their mouth. My guess would be, because I've heard natural law theorists say things like, when an animal rapes another animal, or when a dolphin rapes another dolphin, there's not a moral dimension there. That if that happened in the human realm, for various reasons, maybe because we're made in the image of God, I don't know, but that would be immoral. But when animals do that, they don't participate in the moral dimension. So there would be now morality assigned, either good or bad, to a dolphin raping a dolphin. I've heard natural law theorists say that, and I would agree.
Yeah.
Maybe for different reasons, but I would agree.
And that wouldn't be failing the human flourishing component of anything, but
Yeah, so they might, maybe they make the case that it's not good for dolphin flourishing. And so then you could say then maybe it's immoral on that sense. But that would be different than the human moral sense.
yeah.
But yeah, I could see a natural law theorist saying that. It's always difficult because you want to do your best not to put words in the mouth of your opponent. You want to treat them fairly. But you can see how their positions would lead to certain conclusions, even though they might not see that. And you want to press, lovingly and respectfully your opponent when you see that their theory is resulting in some things that wouldn't necessarily be correct. And vice versa.